Tonight's session is all about Adam Driscoll's PowerShell Pro Tools. And Mike, I don't know how deep we're going to get, honestly. You know, my sweet spot as a teacher is beginner intermediate content. We'll see what happens. My main goal for tonight is to familiarize you with that tool set. And I'm going to make sure as I show you each of its major features, why you would want to use them. I mean, that's a really core principle of adult education, isn't it? Why am I learning this? Why do I care? What's in it for me? So very briefly, before I stop my video and start the demo, I don't have any slides for you tonight. How I came to this tool set? Well, the developer, Adam Driscoll, I admire PowerShell community members for different reasons. And Adam I've always admired for two reasons. One, he's a developer's developer. He's probably forgotten more about .NET development than I'll ever know in my life. And number two, he's balanced, I think, really well community giving, community volunteer contribution on one hand, and developing a business model and a livelihood for himself on the other. So that's how he came onto my radar quite a long time ago. Over the last 10 years or so, I've been writing product reviews for the 4SysOps Technology blog. And I like doing that because it gives me exposure to tools and platforms that I might not come across ordinarily. And a few months ago, I was asked to review the tool set, and I thought, perfect opportunity to get into it and get under the covers, kick the tires, insert whatever metaphor here. And it really put a lot of cool things together for me. And like I said, to kind of round out my introduction, that's my main goal, is to show you how the tool works, you know, from soup to nuts, why you care about installing it, how much does it cost, what's the licensing like, and then, of course, what can it do for you in your PowerShell work. I think you'll be pretty impressed with it. I know that I am. And also, well, I'll show you that momentarily. Hold that thought. Let me stop my video, and I will attempt to share my second monitor. Let's see.
While you're sharing your second monitor, I will just give people a little preview. Adam Driscoll, we were requested from a community member to see if we can get Adam Driscoll to talk about his universal dashboard. We will be having Adam speak sometime before the fall. We haven't settled on a date yet, but Adam and I are discussing that right now. So something to keep your eyes open for.
That's great news, Mike. Can you see my VS Code instance?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good deal. All right, so what you're seeing is a script/demo file that I put together for us tonight. And you can see there on line 8, if you want this file, you'll point your browser to timw.info/summer2019. And that URL will take you to one of my GitHub repos. And in there, you'll find this file and a whole bunch of other doodads. Basically, all my presentations for the summer I'm putting in just a single bucket. Consider it a toy box of sorts. Okay, let's see. Let me get my cursor over here, get my bearings. Okay, so poshtools.com is the project homepage. And from a highest level, what we're talking about here initially is this is a product that gives you PowerShell capability in Visual Studio. Now, you might be thinking, well, I'm a PowerShell person. I'm interested in administrative automation. What do I care about Visual Studio? That's a developer tool. Well, not so fast. I don't know if you're doing anything with Azure yet, but if you are, it's not going to be too long before you start working with resource templates, or really the whole idea of infrastructure as code. Before long, you'll probably wind up in Visual Studio. And so you'll want to, I think, as far as I know, Adam's project here, PowerShell Tools for Visual Studio, is the de facto way to unlock PowerShell language support in Visual Studio. But as you can see on poshtools.com, a single user license is $60 USD. It runs in full pro mode for 21 days, and then the features downgrade to the free tier. And if you go to docs.poshtools.com, that's the documentation library, and there's a feature comparison here between the paid version and the free version of PowerShell Tools. And you can see that Adam's been pretty generous in terms of feature parity. Some things are paid only, like C# to PowerShell code conversion, the bundling and packaging your PowerShell scripts and modules as executables, code obfuscation, and so on and so forth, okay? Another point I want to make about licensing and pricing, just FYI to shorten your learning curve, is that it's per user, which is really convenient if you work on multiple systems. So in other words, for 60 bucks, you've got your license code, and not only can you install it on all of your workstations, but the same code works in all three environments. All three, I mean Visual Studio Code, and then the PowerShell console. And I'll show you, and we'll differentiate those as we go along. Oh, one point that I want to make clear before we begin. I am not, and never have been, and never will be a salesperson, and I'm not a shill. The reason I have a licensed version of PowerShell Pro Tools, I'd happily pay the 60 bucks. But I received a free license from Adam by virtue of my Microsoft MVP award. So if there's any other MVP awardees on the call, know that you can contact Adam and receive a complimentary license. So I'm not shilling. When I share stuff, it's because I believe in it and like it and want to share it with others. Just wanted to make that super clear, okay? Now, as far as installing and starting to rock and roll and getting into these features that you see on this bullet list, there's 3 ways to go there. Like I said, there's 3 variants of the PowerShell Pro Tools. And the first is we can just, from our PowerShell get system, I don't even remember if we're on a server or desktop system right now. It doesn't matter. But we can query the PowerShell gallery. We'll do a find module PowerShell Pro Tools. Bottom line is Adam keeps the console PowerShell tools up on the gallery. And if you install that, I actually have all this code written out here, so I can just select the appropriate commands. Once you install the module on your system, you want to update the help as usual. You can do a manual import or just start tapping directly in on line 24, for instance. We can enumerate the commands in the module. It's a not a huge list of commandlets, but they cover all the different bases. Code conversion, profiling script performance, creating packages, installers, and creating GUIs. So that's one way to go. If you just want to get down to the ground floor and work with this Swiss Army knife toolkit, that's another way you can look at PowerShell Pro Tools, is a sort of Swiss Army knife that has a handful of special purpose functionality. So that's the PowerShell console version. As far as Visual Studio, I've happened to have Visual Studio 2019 installed here. And it's an interesting story here. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, Adam's extension here is the de facto way to get PowerShell language support into Visual Studio. And he told me that as of, I think, Visual Studio 2017, Microsoft, for some inexplicable reason, stopped including it in the installer. Visual Studio 2015 and 2013, you could actually install the PowerShell tools for Visual Studio in the installation process. But as of VS 2017 and 2019, it's a manual thing, but it's not a big deal. We can just go to Extensions, Manage Extensions, and I have it installed, but you would go online to the Visual Studio gallery, and you would just do a search for PowerShell, and you can pop in the extension right here, PowerShell Tools for Visual Studio. Like I said, it's going to run in full unlock. I can't speak. It's a work day. You understand. It runs in full mode for 21 days, and then it downgrades. So you might be wondering, well, how the heck do you get a license? Honestly, I don't know how to license it from the console. You have to check the documentation. To license from Visual Studio, you go to Help, and under About Microsoft Visual Studio, there's About PowerShell Pro Tools. Say that 3 times quickly. And assuming you've purchased a license, go to Posh Tools, you pay your money. Within 10 minutes or so, you'll get your license via email. You just paste it in, and you're good to go. All right? Now, what does that give you? Well, you're seeing some of it right now. Number one, you've got the PowerShell interactive window. So this is the way to get a console host running in Visual Studio itself. That's essentially what it is. And if we echo the host automatic variable, we can scroll up a little bit. Yeah, so it's a custom host, PowerShell engine host that Adam created for this purpose, and you get all of your code completion. So you're able to complete commandlets and parameters, and I bet it would even do enumerations. Let me clear the screen and let me do a set execution policy. Yeah, so it's giving us full IntelliSense code completion that we would expect. Another thing that you get when you load up the PowerShell tools in Visual Studio is this Command Explorer add-on that you see on the right. And what this is doing is loading up all of your modules, and you can search if you're looking for a particular command. Connect AZ account, for instance, if you're an Azure person. It'll show you the module and then the command. If you right-click, you can copy it. That's kind of ho-hum. It just copies and pastes it out onto your surface, your script. The other thing it can do is if you view the details, it essentially just connects to the help, And you can jump right to the examples using the search filter up on top. I found that to be mildly unstable. In fact, it's a little unstable right now, unfortunately. But I'm just walking you through this a step at a time. Come on now, let go. I will say that Adam's super responsive about bug reports. I found that he's super responsive in terms of addressing, feature requests, feedback, all that kind of stuff. Looks like I dumped out of Visual Studio. That's fine. Let's just restart it. I'm going to continue without code. Yeah, so the Command Explorer, that's what it is. Really, I find that the PowerShell interactive window host, the IntelliSense, the code complete stuff, and then finally we have in the File, New Project dialog, the PowerShell tools give you a couple PowerShell-related project templates. You've got a module project and a script project. And the module template project is pester aware and gives you the scaffolding and so forth. As far as that goes. Okay, so let's see. I'm just get service. As far as running code in your scripts, the debugging experience, that's something I haven't really played around with yet in here, but because you're in Visual Studio, I presume that you've got full debugging support. When you right-click a selection, for instance, how you could force that to run in your interactive window down below, you have execute selection, execute script with parameters. So that, I think, is the long story short about Visual Studio and the PowerShell tools. Now, of course, there's far more to this tool set. This is just our initial first run-through in terms of installation and licensing. Now then, what about VS Code, which you're hopefully using given that the PowerShell ISE is rapidly going the way of the dodo? We can install it in Visual Studio Code through, again, the Marketplace here. So if we bring out the Marketplace and do a search for PowerShell Tools, PowerShell Pro Tools, here we go. It's just at first blush, a garden variety extension. Install it. And that unlocks some stuff like this sidebar item called the Module Explorer. If you don't want a sidebar item, for instance, you can always right-click in that little gutter and turn it off. Just FYI, it took me a long time before somebody turned me on to that. And the Module Explorer, I find, is kind of useful. It gives you a full enumeration of all of your modules on that system and also shows the versioning. So, as you know, PowerShell for a couple versions now has allowed side-by-side multiple versions of the same module. So we can take a look at that history here. Let's see if it allows us to do anything else. I don't think it really does anything else. It's just a simple browser. But that's the Module Explorer. Another way we can go here is to open the good old command palette and type Pro Tools. That will list at least some of the options available directly in the command palette. So let's see, show PowerShell Pro Tools, install license key. Right, so the question of how to license this, again, 21-day trial, then it downgrades. You get your key, you just open the command palette, come down to PowerShell Pro Tools, install license key. They'll open up an input box, paste your key in, and you're good to go. Okay? There's a welcome screen that looks a lot like the universal dashboard. And Mike, I'm glad that Adam's going to present that, because that's his other main project. And I know nothing about the dashboard. It's been on my to-do list for months to take a look and see of some of its capabilities. So I'm looking forward to learning more about that. All right, proceeding. Let's take a look. As far as some of the specific functionalities now that the PowerShell tools can offer, one is going beyond measure command. You know, the built-in commandlet for doing some basic benchmarking and profiling performance, command pipeline performance, script performance. There's an extension to that built into the tools here. So for an example, I have a sample file here. I'm going to right-click this and pop it into a different tab. It's just toy code that iterates 1 to 100 and sleeps and so forth. So it serves as an OK test case. And to run a trace on that, a performance trace, we can just do a search. It should just be trace. No, profile, I think it is. Yeah, PowerShell profile script. Something I observed in my testing that I'll just pass along to you. It's funny, normally extensions, the commands in the command palette will always start with the extension name. And I showed you a moment ago that if you do a search for Pro Tools or PowerShell Pro Tools, there are commands that use that. But then there are others, like the one that we were just looking at. I keep forgetting what it's called. Profile, yeah. I need to ask Adam. I'm going to send him a message tonight or tomorrow about this, because this makes me think PowerShell profile script, that it's part of the PowerShell extension and not part of Adam's. In fact, maybe it is. But I don't think so. And you know, what it's supposed to do, this is, again, I don't know if this is a bug. I doubt it's a bug. It's probably the typical problem that I have each day, which is where when I run into a problem, you know where it turns out to be? Between my keyboard and my chair. For some reason, that seems to be the predominant source of my problems. But when I start this correctly, / if the feature is working as expected, for each call, for each pipeline, for each command, you'll get a metric of how long it took to run and how many calls were made within that command. And you can see in the documentation the results of that, but that's kind of ongoing on my workbench to try to learn more about that. In fact, let me click this link here to show you. Come on now, Control click, there we go. Yeah, in fact, I used the exact same code trying to think, well, if I replicate exactly what Adam had, maybe that would help. But this is the expected result, as I said. You see an overall percentage of execution time that was occupied by each of these procedures, and then how many calls. Now, in terms of diving deeper into that, what those calls are, I'm not sure it can go deeper. There are some limitations, as you see here. You can only profile a single script at a time, and when you're profiling a pipeline, it gives you just one summary metric as opposed to breaking out each segment in the pipeline. And it says here, Adam says that in a future version, individual commands will be able to be profiled. Okay? So again, the use case there is you want to see what, if anything, is slowing down your script performance. You just want to put some numbers to your script performance. Show me something. That is the use case for this profile script feature. Next on our trolley ride is packaging. Now, this is interesting. On one hand, you might think, what part of PowerShell command line automation don't you understand? Why would you want to create an executable out of a PowerShell function or a PowerShell script? And a good use case that I've seen, and perhaps you have as well, is where you have automation, you have helper utilities, whatever the case may be, already recorded in PowerShell, but you want to share that with users who may not yet be proficient with PowerShell, or maybe it's not in their job description and they don't care, whatever the case may be. This allows us to package up individual script files or full robust modules as executables, and you wind up not only with an exe file, but with potentially DLL libraries and other dependencies that come along for the ride. And what's happening under the hood when you use the PowerShell tools to package your code as an executable, it runs one of the commandlets in the toolkit called merge script. And the idea there is that you can either load up your script that you want to package. In fact, let me pick another one besides this one. Let's see, new user, new form, hello. Yeah, this is, again, it's all toy code. But this simple function calculates uptime, and as you can see, it's pretty old. We're not even using the sim commandlets yet, but that doesn't matter for our purpose. We load up the script or the module project that we want to package, and we can either come in through the command palette, and there's a command. Again, it doesn't say PowerShell Pro Tools, it just says PowerShell, which confuses me as a user. Package is executable, but I think what I would recommend you do is to do the call to merge script, and then you can pass in all of your configuration parameters as a hash table, as you see here. And essentially, without getting deep into the weeds, because we're going to reach the limits of my knowledge, we've got the root of where your script or your module project exists, your out directory where you want the results to go, and then there's a secondary hash table, which is just a collection of key value pairs, recall, where you can customize the packaging. And you should check out docs.poshtools.com here, because there's some really slick things you can do in here. If it's a console application, you can suppress or show the console window. You can do a custom icon. I mean, that's kind of ho-hum. You can target a particular .NET version, but guess what else you can do? If you're interested in targeting PowerShell Core and making your resulting package as portable as possible, you can actually bundle the .NET Core runtime and PS Core runtime all in the single monolithic package. Isn't that cool? There's an example on the docs page that actually shows that. Let's quickly check that out. So on docs.poshtools.com, let's see if we go down to Visual Studio Code and then packaging in Visual Studio Code. Goes out to another docs page. Yeah, this is it. And there's a couple interesting examples here. The one I used is just creating a simple console app, but you could create a service from your PowerShell code, or what this is showing us, bundling the PowerShell Core engine with your script. You'd need to have the .NET Core SDK installed on the system. And of course, the resulting executable is going to balloon in size. But it's a pretty cool way to do a fully independent executable, you know. So let me see. I've done that. Let me go back to my VS Code. I've run this sample code here and created it. Let me do it again. Let me select this block, right-click, and run the selection. Error it out, probably because in my out folder it may already have the results in it. Let me see. No, I don't. Let me check that again. Hello.ps1 is the source file. Out is the out file. Enabled, hide console window. I commented out the .NET version and the app icon path. Maybe I missed a closing parentheses. Yeah, I think that's what it was. Yeah, so let's come up to out. And let me right-click and reveal that folder in Explorer. And so you've got a config file here. If you look in the documentation, you can really do quite a bit of customization in terms of packaging your PowerShell code. And this is just a simple call. Basically, all this does is runs that function. I have in the function source code, let's go back to hello.ps1. I've got my function definition that calculates uptime, and all I'm having it do is clear the host, run the function with no parameters, and then sleep. So again, it's toy, but hopefully, I'm hoping anyway, that it's getting your mind thinking, yeah, actually, I do have some PowerShell code, and it would be nice to perhaps make it an executable to be run by non-PowerShell proficient folks. And something that I'll leave to your homework that I didn't get to in preparing this for us tonight is the code obfuscation. That would be another layer that I could imagine you've got PowerShell code. Well, on one hand, if you're working in a DevOps or DevOps-friendly shop, you don't want to hide code from your colleagues. But maybe you're creating a tool for customers that's already in PowerShell, so the engine of the tool is already there. You could obfuscate the code and then package as an executable on top of that to preserve your intellectual property and also make the code more portable and universally available. So just an idea that popped off the top of my head. So let me close up the Explorer here and come back to our script file here. Next on the docket is code conversion. This is interesting. I found in my work with the PowerShell community, and I talked to a lot of people about this at the PowerShell Summit this year, of when you reach a certain level of familiarity with PowerShell and you just realize, wow, there's so much that I do with my PowerShell scripts that's very much like object-oriented programming. What's to stop me from just going a little bit further and, say, learning the C# language and accessing the full .NET Framework, .NET Standard, .NET Core? So to that point, you may have C# source code available that you may want to convert to PowerShell, and vice versa. You may have a PowerShell function that in your development work moving to C#, you want a head start on your C# development, so wouldn't it be nice to be able to convert PowerShell source code to C#? And so that's what we have here in the PowerShell Pro Tools, is bidirectional conversions from PowerShell to C#, C# to PowerShell. And as this comment on line 60 says, we're just going to open up the source code, and then directly from the command palette, we can either call convert to PowerShell or convert to C#. So let me select, I've got hello.ps1 already up there, so why don't I load up line 61.
Hey, Tim, while you're doing that, we had a quick question.
This is actually a real console application. This is a C# source file that creates a simple console calculator. In Visual Studio Code, ever helpful, as you see in the lower right corner of the screen, Visual Studio detects, based on your file type, what language that you're likely using. VS Code sees that we're using a CS file, so it's asking us, do we want to install the C# extension, which actually sounds like a pretty good idea, come to think of it.
Question?
And it's happening automagically down below. But anyway, back to our regularly scheduled programming. What does this look like if we convert it to PowerShell? Let's just go ahead and do it. We'll open up the command palette and do convert to PowerShell. So C#, convert to PowerShell. Boom. It should pop open right in place. That's something I guess I would warn you about. If you want to preserve your original source file, make a copy and then do the conversion on a copy. So what happened here? It looks like we're now using the function keyword, and because C# uses main as its entry point, that's what we're calling the function here until we change it. We've got the familiar param block and a bunch of calls. I mean, the quality of the conversion, I'm not really the right person to ask, but I would hope and trust that it's at least going to get you farther down the path if you are facing having to refactor C# code to PowerShell or PowerShell to C#. So let's see. I wonder, just for grins, if we run this file, what will happen? How do you want to open this file? I haven't actually run this code, so I'm not exactly sure what it's going to do. I would hazard the uneducated guess that you're going to have to do some refactoring. It's not just hit convert and then run and you're happy. Maybe in a super simple case, like let's try this one here. So in a PowerShell source file, we can do a convert to PowerShell. Or no, I'm sorry, it would be a convert to C#. PowerShell convert to C#. Yeah, so, I mean, we don't have using or namespace declarations, which we may or may not need. Object query, searcher. Yeah, I mean, you know, you could be picky, I guess. You could say, wow, that's pretty verbose. I might say in response, isn't C# a super verbose language anyway? But anyway, at least I showed you how it works. That's the code conversion from C# to PowerShell, PowerShell to C#. Understand that when you run the command, it actually modifies that current file, so I would make a copy before working with this. Also, remember that you're likely having to do some cleanup and some additional refactoring after you do your conversion. All right. Last piece here is the GUI thing. And what do I mean by that? Similar to that notion of packaging your PowerShell code, you may want a more agile approach. That is, where you're sharing your PowerShell source code with maybe support desk or help desk personnel that are not PowerShell proficient. It's not in their scope, their job scope, unfortunately. And you find that maybe packaging your code isn't agile enough. Because, I mean, let's face it, once you turn a cucumber into a pickle, you can't go from pickle to cucumber. You like that? Similarly, once you have your binary, you're going to have to just recompile the binary when you make code updates. Maybe this, what we're seeing here, might be a little more agile, where you can generate a WinForms, a standard Win32 forms application from your PowerShell function or module, or the WPF, the Windows Presentation Foundation. I believe the WPF design is limited to Visual Studio. In Visual Studio Code, it uses the Win32, which is the traditional Windows forms. And from what I've read on Adam's blog, he is planning, because I think, last I knew, PowerShell Core is beginning to support WinForms. Initially, I guess it was a total no-go. But I think that that support is forthcoming. So this GUI stuff, I imagine, will work in PowerShell Core eventually, but right now it only works in PowerShell Desktop or Windows PowerShell. And as you can see in the lower right corner of my VS Code, my PowerShell engine is in fact 5.1 Desktop. So in VS Code, the way to generate a GUI from your source code, your PowerShell source, there's a fast way and a more complex way. Check the time. Okay, we're doing well on time, it looks like.
You want to stop for some questions?
You just have a single function, like I have here, this new user.ps1. Excuse me. And I grabbed this from the Posh Tools site. Very simple toy code, where we have a string parameter for username, a switch, enabled or not, and then there's a department parameter that has a validate set. So you can choose administrator, IT, or HR, and then the output, it just echoes that, you know. So you've got a file with just a single function definition in it, and then we can do a view command palette, and then we've got PowerShell generate Windows form. And a couple things happen when you do that. You probably should put the source file in a separate folder. Otherwise, I've got everything in my summer 2019. It's a bit gnarly to try to find the other files. But you've got, besides the source file, new user.ps1, notice that there's a new user.form.ps1 and a new user.form.designer. New user.form, let's take a look at what it's doing here. It's creating a type, a Windows form type object, and it looks like it's generating controls here based on the parameters that you have in your function definition. And eventually it does a show dialog. So the idea is, once the PowerShell Pro Tools creates your assets, you would then run the form file, which we'll do in just a second, to actually see and interact with the GUI. If we look at the form designer, what is that doing? Let's see. Yeah, it looks like this is fully defining the GUI. Wow, it's a pretty robust file. And let's select the form and do a terminal run active file.
Hey, Tim, can you hear me?
The display a little bit. So this generate form from function is just meant, and that's an interesting turn of phrase, isn't it? You talk about form and function. Here we're generating a form from a function. But anyway, it doesn't give us a whole lot of flexibility on the front end. It's just a quick GUI layer that creates controls based on your parameters and creates an event handler here. And as you can see on lines 3 and 4, when we select items here, our username, the enabled is a switch, so it's an on-off. Departments and enumeration, so we can select one or the other. When we click submit, it fires off this button click event handler, and what does that do? Well, it calls our function, and it passes in our content that we added to the form as parameter values. Pretty neat, huh? I suppose you could combine this, that is, the function and this GUI layer, and then combine that with the packager to create an exe. I just had that idea now. I'm sure I'm not the first or last person to have that idea, but there you go. All right, so that's that. That's the quick way to generate a GUI from a function. And lastly, there's what's called the Windows Form Designer. So here we can start from an existing file, or we can create a new blank PS1 file, because the idea here is that we're literally going to build as we go along. So we can go View, Command Palette. There it is down here, Show Windows Form Designer. And a couple things happened there. It starts to populate the file immediately by creating, instantiating a forms object, invoking the dialog, and it's basically going to code behind. As you work through this design surface, which is very much like Visual Studio, isn't it? You've got your drag and drop surface on the left, you've got your Windows controls over here on the right, and let's see, you can select it. Do you double click it? No, right click, drag. Come on now. Did this just a few hours ago. Come on. Oh, you draw it. Okay, so you select it and you draw it. And then you set your properties down below, as you can see. So if I select the form, we can name it. And then we can set the label of the button. So the idea here is that instead of having to know the XAML or whatever is happening to actually build, or I guess XAML would be a WPF form, but all of the code behind creating the surface and aligning the controls, you can do it graphically. And if you double left click a control like the button, it should create a handler for us here. Let's see. We've got new form.ps1. We've got new form. There should be some other assets in here as well. Is that? Yeah, new form.designer. I think. No, I'm confused here, everybody. Sorry. Let me close everything but that one file. Let me bring this over here. Now let me close to the right. Yeah, I should have put this in another folder because I'm getting all munged up here. Never mind. I told you I'd be a little clumsy on this, eh? Again, the idea is you're creating the surface, and then you will have to go into the code behind and write out your event handlers, what happens when you click buttons and choose controls. But it's just meant to shorten. I think the main selling point here is instead of having to know XY coordinates and do all that kind of nonsense with raw code, you can build your interface more graphically and then dive in terms of fetching text box values and event handlers for buttons and that kind of stuff. If you've used Sapiens tools before, particularly PowerShell Studio, that's what this reminds me of. And I gotta say, $60 is a heck of a lot less expensive than the license cost for PowerShell Studio. But your mileage may vary, as they say. So, in terms of summing up, let's see if we missed anything. Let's come back here. Let me bring out my PowerShell Pro Tools script one more time.
Hey, Tim, can you hear us?
Yeah, that looks like the end. Let me scroll up to the top, clear the screen, and let me just say, in summary, what we've got here, again, is a Swiss Army knife tool set that's got a number of different abilities, creating a GUI for your code, packaging, obfuscating your code, profiling code performance. You install it, you pay for your license. You can install on as many machines as you have, and you can also install in as many hosts as you want. PowerShell Console, Visual Studio Code. I think that's really the long and the short of it, everybody. Any questions, comments, concerns, or curiosities about this or anything else?
Hey, Tim, can you hear us?
Bueller? Anyone?
Tim, can you hear us?
Tim.
Somehow Tim lost audio.
Well, I think that's about it. I could sing. I've got my guitar here, but as far as PowerShell Pro Tools, I think that's the end of the old road. Thank you again for having me.
Tim, are you there?